heated battle over abortion in the UK. It concerns the protests outside clinics. Are they an expression of free speech or harassment of women?
A landmark free speech victory at the High Court for a man who was warned by police about allegedly transphobic messages on social media.
Thing in the free speech debate. Political correctness should be kicked out.
Like the man arrested in Oxford for calling a police force gay.
Lucas has become the latest person to be caught by the government's new counter-extremism powers after she campaigned against fracking earlier this year. Police applied for
introduced to prevent radicalisation, tackle extremism in all its forms.
And he was taken away by a police car, seemingly under arrest. Although police are yet to make any comment, it would appear officers used powers afforded to them under the recently introduced extremism disruption orders.
The United Kingdom, a once great country that gave the world the Magna Carta, William Shakespeare and Charles Dickens, is now arresting and even jailing its own loyal citizens simply for speaking their minds. British police have failed to solve a single burglary in nearly half of the country's neighbourhoods over the past 3 years. Some forces won't even dispatch an officer to a burglary after it's reported because they don't consider it a policing priority. Instead of cracking down on knife crime or burglaries, crimes that ruin people's lives, British police have decided that offence is the greatest policing priority and are jailing people simply for offensive Twitter comments. 3,395 people have been arrested in just 1 year for these offensive online comments, and this has resulted in thousands of police hours being wasted tracking down individuals that simply hurt someone else's feelings. But how did police become more concerned with protecting the feelings of people rather than trying to prevent livelihood-destroying burglaries and violent knife crime? It turns out that the death of free speech has been a slow and painful one, occurring over multiple decades. All the while, the unsuspecting British public has sat by, unaware that their rights were slowly being chipped away. The police's invasion of the online world in Britain has been made possible by a multitude of laws. The first hate speech law to be passed in the UK was surprisingly almost 40 years ago in 1986. The Public Order Act criminalises racially aggravated speech. After that, British lawmakers left free speech alone until 2003 when the Malicious Communications Act was passed that criminalises offensive, indecent or menacing speech in electronic media. These were the first statutes that police used to colonise the internet. At first, hate speech laws were only in place to prevent racially motivated speech and religious hatred, but as is inevitable with hate speech laws, they have since expanded the number of protected groups. Although the UK is experiencing an invasion of online privacy by the police, even police officers themselves are not safe from tyrannical hate speech laws. An ex-police constable who posted racist WhatsApp memes mocking the death of George Floyd was jailed for 20 weeks. This man had to spend 140 days of his life in a jail cell for posting offensive memes in a private group chat. But of course, it doesn't stop there. A man named Stephen Dodds tweeted a picture of two solicitors worshipping during the halftime break of a football match. The photo was captioned, "Muslims praying at halftime at the match yesterday, #disgrace." The football club then reported the tweet to Merseyside police who investigated the matter. In essence, a man was investigated by the police for using a hashtag on Twitter. Never mind speech crime or even tweet crime, we now have hashtag crime. A journalist, Katie Hopkins, was reported to the police and bizarrely to the International Criminal Court for writing a column in The Sun in which she referred to African migrants trying to get to Europe as cockroaches. Now, her views are, in my opinion, frankly abhorrent and ought to be condemned entirely, but it is also insane to suggest that she should be investigated by the police for simply saying those words. This isn't the first time she's been reported to the police either. She's been reported before for hate crimes against fat people because she said fat people are just lazy, which is apparently a policing matter these days. In the end, the police didn't charge her for her fat shaming, but they did interrogate her for her earlier sins. These stories may seem just a little bit insane to you, but don't worry, it continues to get worse. A man was questioned by police for over 30 minutes after he liked a tweet that appeared to make fun of a transgender woman. The justification for the formal probe by Humberside Police was into his thinking and his reasons for liking the tweet. If you live in the UK, after hearing this, you should be scared. We're at a point where you can literally be dragged down to a police station and questioned for thought crime. The United Kingdom is quickly becoming a dystopian Orwellian country, the foundations for which were set decades ago the moment the government legislated speech. So why isn't the British public up in arms over their slowly diminishing rights? There's two answers to that simple question. The first is a lack of understanding. The greatest problem with legislating against hate speech is trying to determine what exactly hate is. It turns out that over any reasonable period of time, exactly the people who you least want to define hate will get to define it. And so the consequences of that regulation become incalculably worse than the problem the regulation was put in place to solve. The second answer to this query is that millions of Brits have fallen victim to the dangerous ideology that is political correctness. So what exactly is political correctness? Well, to be politically correct is to choose words and sometimes actions that avoid offending people. Abiding by this philosophy makes you infinitely more likely to support hate speech laws that prevent offense. The term actually dates back to nearly a century ago during the reign of Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, when socialists around the world were bitterly divided. Some socialists thought that Stalin was a brutal dictator and undermined socialist ideals of egalitarianism, and the hardline partisan communists stood by whatever the Soviet Union did and viewed the country as the reference point for correct socialism. Socialists criticized these hardline communists and used the term politically correct to express disagreement with the party line. It was used by socialists against communists and was used to separate out socialists who believed in egalitarian moral ideas from dogmatic communists who would advocate and defend party positions regardless of their moral substance. The term seemed to die out for a few decades until the 1970s, when new liberals who were attempting to make huge changes to Western culture brought it back. This group, which were collectively called the New Left, used the term politically correct as a sort of self-critical satire. It was a term for when they realized that some of their beliefs might anger fellow activists. However, over time, use of the term expanded in universities not just to incorporate limited academic freedom, but also to include the rhetoric of victimization, support of multiculturalism, using affirmative action, sanctions against hate speech, revisionist history, and the rise of identity politics. The spread of political correctness is exactly why a worrying proportion of British citizens support hate speech laws. The fatal flaw with political correctness is that anyone can be offended by anything. Czechoslovakia under Soviet rule serves as a stark warning from history that political correctness is a dangerous ideology. Back in the 1980s, within communist Czechoslovakia, conformity to the political establishment was so imposing that the regime employed secret police to ensure that nobody was expressing or harboring the wrong political ideas. This measure enacted by the secret police was considered necessary because without it, a person might actually adopt ideas that appeal to their conscience, and even worse, they might start saying what they believe. As an ordinary citizen, you didn't know who was part of the secret police. It could be your best friend, your neighbor, or even a family member. You couldn't fully trust anyone. Political correctness provided a breeding ground for the authoritarianism that reared its ugly head in Czechoslovakia. The United Kingdom is edging ever closer to a dangerous precipice, with a dark fall into the same authoritarianism below. The fact that a man was questioned by the police for half an hour simply because he liked to tweet and they were concerned as to what views he might hold should be a wake-up call for every British citizen. Freedom of speech and freedom of thought are cornerstones of the great diversity and belief that can be found in the West. Without that diversity, it's impossible to maintain a range of political choices to vote for, and without dialogue and diverse ideas, oppression and violence become normative. When we start insisting that certain political ideas are the correct ones and others are incorrect, that essential diversity begins to deteriorate. Many British people who have fallen victim to the ideology of political correctness hold the belief that hate speech laws should exist to prevent the breakdown of democracy and to stop political violence. This argument, however, is historically inaccurate, so let's go all the way back to Weimar Germany. The Weimar government had very stringent hate speech laws, including laws preventing anti-Semitic speech. Der Stürmer was one of the most openly anti-Semitic newspapers at the time, and it was prohibited from publishing or even had its copies confiscated by the government at least 36 times in the final years of democracy in Germany. In that same 10-year period, the Nazis were steadily gaining support and power in Germany, and yet the hate speech laws of the Weimar Republic did nothing to stop the spread of Nazism in the country. This example not only proves that hate speech laws don't prevent political violence or the breakdown of democracy, they simply force it underground, where it can thrive and grow under the radar. This is simply because hate speech laws are inherently going to be enforced in ways that further entrench and solidify dominant political and societal groups, because even when authorities act in utmost good faith, they cannot enforce hate speech laws without always being unduly vague and influenced by their own subjective values or those of other people. A good example of this occurring would be the fact that British lawmakers have added gender identity as a protected characteristic, and this has resulted in legal penalties for misgendering. This action was clearly influenced by left-wing progressive values because conservatives mostly consider gender theory to be false and dangerous for society, and the average left-wing progressive simply sees gender identity as an aspect of someone's personality that ought to be celebrated. Progressives see any criticism of someone's gender identity to be an act of political incorrectness, and so adding gender identity to the list of characteristics protected by hate speech regulation shows a clear political bias. People in support of hate speech laws often make the argument that limiting certain fringe views is essential to maximize the free speech of the majority. The argument states that there are people who can be affected by discourse in a way that does not necessarily lead to violence against them, but can lead them to feeling like they don't belong to society. Without certain limitations on what others may say, they find themselves unable to speak freely. By this logic, it is essential to silence the extreme so that those threatened may speak out. Now, there is some legitimacy to this idea. This can and does happen on occasion, and although this is without a doubt a bad outcome, it is outweighed by the dangers of introducing hate speech laws in the first place. The fundamental problem with regulating hate speech is, once again, who defines hate. Hate is an entirely subjective concept because what might be a simple statement of biological truth for one person is a deeply bigoted transphobic remark to another. And the answer to who defines hate is that over any reasonable period of time, it will be exactly the people who you least want to define it. So the consequences of said regulation become incalculably worse than the problem the regulation was put in place to solve. You can't define hate, so you ought not try to regulate it. The weirdest thing about all this is that the very people who scream of injustices by the Conservative Party, who cry foul at every single thing a Conservative government minister does, also wish them to be given even more power when it comes to deciding what can and can't be said. At the end of the day, me personally, I am not the one most at risk of these laws. I am a Conservative Party member and in general support this government and don't go around making racist tweets on Twitter. But when tyranny strikes, when the government pulls off its mask and decides that political dissent can no longer be tolerated, it will be those who advocated for these hate speech laws that will find themselves dragged down to the police station to explain their tweets rallying against this government. It should be obvious by now that Britain is in a very concerning state. Hate speech laws clearly do not work, and yet British politicians are frequently trying to restrict free speech further. All of the hate speech laws that are currently holding millions of British citizens hostage, preventing them from voicing their political beliefs, need to go. But that cannot be done until millions of people also strip themselves of the self-imposed chains that is political correctness.